Welcome to today's special presentation of One Soccer Today, where we will recap and look ahead from 2024 to 2025 in the Canadian Premier League. We'll do that with Oliver Platt and Gareth Wheeler. So many things we could begin with. A season that had all the twists and turns.
Matching outfits.
Love this league as much as possible. The boys in black are ready to get to question number one. Much like the dynasty that Men in Black was, the dynasty of Forge, is it over, Oliver Platt, after they were dethroned by Cavalry at long last?
No, it's not over. I think this team is still going to go into the 2025 season as one of two teams you expect to be the last two standing at the end of the year. We'll see, and we'll get onto that later if anyone else can break that dominance and make some noise. But I think we've got to remember that as much as it came apart a little bit at the end of the season due to some injuries and suspension, for most of the year, we were having the debate of, is this the best Forge team ever? Right? So dominant were they in the regular season at the top of the standings. So I don't think it's nearly done. I think obviously the big coin to fall in that sense would be when Bobby Smyrniotis moves on from this club, and we'll see what happens there this offseason. But for the time being, I think Forge are still going to continue to be one of the dominant teams in this league, if not the dominant team.
No, for sure. And if the dynasty is not over, at least we might have turned a page from every year with Forge keeping so much of their core. It almost felt inevitable we'd see them towards the end of the year. Famously, Gareth, you coined the CPL playoffs Forge season until this year when Cavalry finally changed that up. Do you agree with Ollie that maybe a blip in the radar, or maybe not all cause for concern in Hamilton?
I'd love to disagree with my well-dressed colleague, Oliver Platt, but I can't. He's right. What evidence is there to suggest that Forge will not be one of the front runners in the Canadian Premier League? Like, it's tough to win year in, year out, guys. Like, it's very, very difficult. That team was able to replace the right back, their left back, their goalkeeper with relative ease. The one position that they didn't and were unable to replace mid-season was a number 9. And that's because they lost Kwesi Poku, and a really good young player that emerged from their ranks, by the way, developed there within Forge, and transferred him on, and just didn't have a player that was fit or did have the fitness at that time to step in and take those reins. And it's not as if that Cavalry being some obscure team living in the wilderness of the Canadian Premier League, not competitive, coming out of nowhere to snatch away, a North Star Cup. These two teams have been the front runners, and with both of them playing in the Champions League Cup in a very short time from now, there's very little reason to believe that either one of these sides will take a step back.
That's an excellent point, with the two teams that represented the Canadian Premier League and Champions Cup last year doing it the same in 2025 as well. The obvious miss for Forge this season was that number 9, and depending on which pundit at One Soccer you ask, Cavalry had a pretty good one, and that's Tobias Warschewski. And he didn't get maybe the attention in the end of season awards, not the Players Player of the Year, not the league MVP. Maybe if you were to ask for a second half MVP or just even the playoffs, he did win finals MVP, and rightfully so. But when we look ahead to 2025 with Cavalry, Gareth, do you think the number 1 player in the Canadian Premier League, if we were to do a CPL fantasy draft, would that be Tobias Warschewski?
Well, a fantasy draft is a different question of whether he's the best player going into 2025. He's a number 9 in a league with very few top number 9. So in that case, he would be a top fantasy pick. But is he head and heels the best player in the Canadian Premier League entering 2025? You'd have to say no on the balance of it. And it's not because the player isn't a really good player. He went on an outstanding run of form to finish the season where he became virtually unplayable. But that was for the last 6 games of the year. On the balance of the season, the Canadian Premier League players themselves named Brian Wright as the top player, the most difficult player to play against in the CPL. Tristan Borges won the MVP of this league. And there's other positions that aren't as glamorous that have really good players as well. Is Alessandro Hujabrapor back in the Canadian Premier League? Is Dan Klomp back in the CPL next year? Is Kyle Becker still Kyle Becker? Like, there is some real competition. I just don't think that any one player is in a position to call themselves head and heels above the rest. Now, if Warschewski can carry over that form that he showed over the last 6 weeks of the season, then yeah, I can listen to that case being made. But a season's 28 games plus, and there a lot more goes into it. So at this point, no, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being the top player in 2025.
All salient points, Oliver Platt. What I find fascinating is that we previously brushed upon Champions Cup. To me, of both teams representing the Canadian Premier League in this continental competition, I think if I'm Tommy Wheeldon Jr., I think I've got the best player heading into February's matches in Warschewski.
Yeah, I take Wills's point that, like, okay, there are some candidates, and he went through them, who you could see in front of Warschewski next season, who could have better seasons. We'll have to wait and see. But like right now, entering 2025, for me, the face of the league is Tobias Warschewski. And we just asked the question, is Forge's dynasty over? I don't think it is. But the only reason we're answering that question is because a guy just dismantled them in the playoffs for the first time, and in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. And that was obviously Warschewski. You know, he was the final MVP. It wasn't even a debate. If you'd had a MVP for the whole playoffs, it wouldn't have even been a debate. Like this guy dominated games at a key time of year against Forge. The two biggest games of the year against the team that's been so dominant at that time of year, in a way I've never seen a player in this league do against Forge in the 6 years we've covered it. We've been watching this league. So yeah, for me, he's the guy. Like I said, I'd describe it as the face of the league entering the new year.
Versatile in multiple very desirable positions as well. And Gareth, I see your point about the number 2. To me, the outcome was basically the kickoff to the playoffs, and he won the Golden Boot in the entire league on that day as well. I think if I had to pick, I'm siding with Oliver Platt on this one, at least heading into 2025. A player that we want to discuss next came really from obscurity in terms of our consciousness of this league and the players that can be impactful, the players that can have the biggest upside, perhaps. And that is Shola Jimoh, who went from coming through the York United youth system before officially the club announced in this offseason that they're launching a League One Ontario side. You imagine he would have been very much involved with that. But this is a young man, a teenager, who is handling high school and also handling Canadian Premier League professionals. So much so that aside from a pretty nice gift from his gaffer when he scored his first professional goal, he also probably got an even better present, and that was a look from Jesse Marsh to attend a Canadian men's national team camp. Of all the years, and there have been 6 of them now, Oliver Platt, is this the closest we've ever been in the Canadian Premier League to a proper prodigy?
Yeah, I think so. And it comes with a little bit of, you have to be careful because he's 16 years old, and I'll get to that. But like, firstly, I'll just give my opinion based on watching him. I went through the list today of like every player under 18 who's played in this league. I think he's the best one we've had, just on a talent level. And then you look at some of the stats, and like it's indisputable that no 16-year-old has done what he was able to do last season. The closest was Tahid last season. But he pretty much stands alone there. And then even when you look at under 18s, like Lowell Wright had his first full season in 2021. He was 18, had 6 goals, 3 assists. That stands out. Tyler Hurtado, I believe, had 6 goals in the 2019 season. There's a little bit of a warning implicit there, and that sometimes what you do as a teenager in the CPL is not necessarily a great indicator of what player you are at 21 or 25 or whatever. And you can go through the list in a different way and see some guys like Victor Loturi at 18 didn't play much. There's a kid called Ahmed Ogamdi who played at 18 in the CPL in 2019 who went for millions of dollars in the Saudi League a year ago. So that's not necessarily a predictor of what's going to happen later in your career. But in terms of what he is right now, compared to other teenagers who have played in this league, I think he's the best we've seen, and certainly the most exciting prospect.
Yeah, the name that came to mind for me was Lowell Wright. Like, he ticked all the boxes to have that label attached to him. And that's why I'm uncommitted to attaching that label to Shola Jimoh as well. Not because I don't believe in the player, not because I don't rate him. I think that there's other young players that need the requisite playing time that he had in order to take their game to the next level, in order to show how good they are. For me, one of the most disappointing parts of the season was I didn't see enough of TJ Tahid and Grady McDonald out in Vancouver. Another really good young player. So Jimoh, unlike a lot of other players in their situations, what was at a time and place and a club that needed to rely upon him, and he actually supplanted other players to get that look in that team. So it requires a brave manager to lean on young players, but I think that there could be more Shola Jimohs in the CPL. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. That's why using the term prodigy, I just don't like the connotations. I don't like the pressure. I don't like the bedded in expectation for players that are really just starting their career. So I'm uncomfortable with that term, although I rate the player. And I hope that other 16, 17, 18-year-olds are afforded the opportunity to make that jump next year as well.
Yeah, it's the second season that always seems to be the most challenging for these young pros when they're no longer a surprise and there's enough scout and you're not necessarily taking them for granted. It's one of the things I think a lot of CPL supporters are most interested in seeing in 2025 is how they continue to monitor him, the 9 stripes. And we could talk about that and how many minutes he gets, like Gareth alludes to, because at the moment, at the time of taping, there's only 5 players signed to York United. So he seems like he's going to have to play a whole lot of minutes. And we'll actually stay with York United with our next topic, with the story perhaps, or the most shocking story when it happened in 2024. York United comes in, they have the new ownership. There's all kinds of optimism and enthusiasm. And the start wasn't even that dire for the club, but it didn't take very long until the Pascal brothers, the new owners and the people who run this team, quite frankly, to say, we're not playing the right type of football that we want to play, that we want to pay for, that we want to build. And with that, Martin Nash was sacked and Benjamin Moore was brought in and led this club to some club first in that they hosted their first ever playoff game. They won that game. They surprised a lot of people. They had that incredible run when the season, when he first took over, the tenure was almost unblemished to start in that extended honeymoon period. Season comes to a close with some drama against Atletico Ottawa. Could they have won that game if a couple bounces go their way? If their captain scores a penalty, sure they could have, and who knows what they would have done from there. But alas, for Coach Mora, his last game in the league was a penalty shootout defeat, and very promptly the rumor mill started to speculate, and even before the match, that he wasn't going to be back this year, that this was a flash in the pan, unbridled success for the club, and then they were back to square one. Shortly thereafter, confirmed he's off to Liga MX, back to his home country to coach professionally there. El Profesor Mario Eustáquio takes over. That's the synopsis. I think it's a pretty thorough one. I'm proud of myself for not even needing to reference my notes. Gareth Wheeler, how does this reflect, though, on the Canadian Premier League? To have a coach that comes in, uses this as a platform. Is it a vote of confidence for other coaches who might want that career reset as well? Does it say maybe it's just a stopgap for some coaches in their coaching prime? What do you make of it when you read the tea leaves?
The El Profesor. Wow, that was something else. I think it's a lot to do with how Benjamin Mora fares at Querétaro in Liga MX. If he's successful there, I think it bodes really well for the Canadian Premier League. A manager using the CPL as a platform to go out and prove himself at the next level. Like, Liga MX is a huge league. It's a big deal. It's the man's home country. Like, this is a dream come true, being able to manage at that level and a club in that league. And the fact that he was able to show what type of manager he was when he was with the Canadian Premier League, it's a launching pad. This is what it's all about for players, for managers, for executives. If you end up staying in the CPL and end up being ultimately successful there, then that's great as well. But the fact that a manager is coveted by a Liga MX club who's managing in the CPL, I think that's a great sign. There are MLS managers that wouldn't get that kind of opportunity, right? So the fact that the new ownership is leveraging their connections and understanding who they know from a managerial perspective, from a player perspective, and then affording them opportunities when they present themselves. This is what it's all about. So I think that this could be a really feel-good story, and I wish Benjamin Mora all the best. I hope that he's a resounding success. So more top leagues will look at the CPL, say, hey, if Mora from the CPL comes here and does this, then who else might be available to come help elevate our respective clubs? So I think it's a good thing.
Mora to Moro, perhaps. Oliver Platt, what do you think?
More of us could be successful in the CPL, maybe.
There we go, 3 for 3.
Yeah, that was weak. I think a couple of things stand out to me here. Number one is just that someone who had coached in Liga MX before he came to the CPL and has now got another Liga MX job after he was in the CPL, found the CPL interesting and appealing enough as a project to want to come here, right? Like, that I think is a good, it bodes well for the league going forwards in terms of its ability to attract talent. And then the second thing I'd just say is that it was a good hire by York United, and it was the first hire made by the new ownership, which I think is also a positive sign going forwards. Really happy that they've given Mauro Stacchio an opportunity and a platform as a young Canadian coach now to take the team forwards into 2025. But I think they got this right. You know, there were some questions asked when they let go of Martin Nash that early in the season. But clearly it rejuvenated the team. It added a spark, some freshness to the group, and they went on to have a pretty good season, I think, when you look at their squads, maybe compared to teams that were possibly a little bit deeper and had a little bit more quality than York United. I think they had a good campaign. So 2 positives for me there that I think are good things to come out of that story.
All right, Ollie, you've been patient. You wanted to talk earlier about who might be next in the Canadian Premier League after outlining the successes of Cavalry and Forge that remained in 2024. We look into the crystal ball now and start to ponder, start to make some guesses, some approximations of how next year might go. And as we sit right now, today, as we tape, who do you think has the best chance from that second 6, outside of the top 2, what I'm getting at, to get in there and win a North Star Cup or a CPL Shield?
I'm going to go with Atletico Ottawa. I think they have an intriguing situation. Obviously, a lot still undecided, but I think their starting point is good. You know, this is a team that, under contract or with options for next year, has several players who you would consider to be at their best, among the best in the CPL at their respective positions. I believe they've only got 1 international spot that's currently occupied, so there's a lot of flexibility for them, and probably, you know, few teams in this league are as effective at using those spots as Atletico Ottawa with the links and the contacts they've got. And they're bringing in the new president, and they're going to bring in a new head coach. And I think it was probably just the right time after 3 seasons with Carlos Gonzalez for that to happen. So I think that has the potential to have the same kind of impacts that we were just talking about with York United as well. So I'm intrigued by what they're going to be able to build and what they might be in 2025.
Gareth Wheeler.
Don't mind the Ottawa shout, but I think that the correct answer to that question, which will also answer a future question that will come up on this show, is Halifax Wanderers. They have the nucleus, they have the foundation to be the team that takes that next step. A full season of Mekadesh and Rhea, those are 2 really good pieces to build around, who almost joined a little bit too late in order to properly have them really changed the fortunes of Halifax when they were struggling throughout last season. The fact that Julian Dunn's coming back, Thomas Mayer-Jaguar is a statement signing, adding him at center back. They're going to improve at the goalkeeping position. I think I can see a player like Diego Coimbra taking a step forward next year. I think there's enough pieces where if they could ever sort out their problems with their away form, then they're going to be a team that no one's going to enjoy playing. I think that Patrice Geyser plays a brand of football that's conducive to playing on the front foot, that once he gets all of his ducks in a row, I think that they can really make some noise here. So I think the answer is Halifax. I mean, their core is good enough to take that next step, and I can't wait to see if they do.
Good news from our pundits for the easternmost clubs in the Canadian Premier League. A last thought on Forge and Cavalry for the program today, and it seems like every time that there's a coaching vacancy in Canada right now, Tommy Wheeldon Jr. and Bobby Smyrniotis are immediately linked to the opening, at least to have a conversation and apply for the job. So far, it's yet to happen, but 6 years, each club now has each manager has won a Coach of the Year. Each manager has a CPL Shield and a North Star Cup success in different tournaments, whether that's beating MLS opposition in the Canadian Championship or playing an entertaining brand of football in continental play. They are the 2 on the Mount Rushmore for now for Canadian Premier League coaches, but we know that they're not going to stay forever, Gareth, and whether that's this offseason, whether it's early into the new year, whenever it does happen, how significant will it be for the Canadian Premier League to lose one of those 2 managers?
Well, by the nature of managers' jobs or head coaching positions, like typically coaches don't stay for an extended period of time in the modern times. I think that this is a good scenario that both these individuals are still in the Canadian Premier League and continue to take their respective projects forward. They continue. I think they're becoming better managers as well, to be honest with you. I think that playing in CONCACAF, trying and testing themselves against some established managers elsewhere, the men that you're looking at, Tommy Wheeldon Jr., I think he's had more turnaround in his side where he's pushed on really good young players to go play elsewhere, to take their next step in their careers. And he's rebuilt his team multiple times now, and he continues to do it. It's like they become a better version of themselves each time. So, look, I don't think that if I'm them, I'm comfortable in my position. If a really good opportunity comes about, yeah, I want to throw my hat in the mix, but there's nothing wrong with staying with these clubs where they have stability, stature, and the respect of everyone around them. When they do leave, this is part of the process. You know, I don't think it's anything more than that. Cavalry will move on. There's great players or former players waiting in the wings, by the way, with both of those projects. Nick Ledgerwood would be a shoo-in for me based on his experience to step into that head coaching role in Cavalry if he wants to. If Tommy moves on, he wants to be his assistant, then that's fine. And David Edgar as well, another former Canadian men's national team player who's been doing the work under Bobby Sminiotis' lead with Forge. So again, this is just the nature of the game. This is the nature of the business. But as long as they're here in the Canadian Premier League, I think it's just provides everyone an opportunity to become better and better.
Oliver Platt.
Well, firstly, I don't want to rule out a scenario where we have our own CPL version of Guy Roux, who coached Auxerre from 1961 to 2005, which is just one of the most incredible statistics or facts, I think, in football. But no, obviously you would expect probably sooner rather than later. I think these guys are going to get an opportunity based on what they've achieved in the CPL. And, I do think that whenever one or both moves on, it is going to be enormously consequential for the CPL and how it's viewed, because no one represents this league more and I think is more associated with this league than those two coaches, right? So their success going forwards, fairly or unfairly, I think is a massive thing for the Canadian Premier League and the way it will be perceived. And then you look at the consequences that would be there in the league itself as well. I agree with Wheels that there's a lot of really good young coaches coming through at both clubs and across the league who you'd be excited to see potentially get the opportunity and that kind of succession plan to be in place. But the reality is that Tommy Wheeldon Jr. and Bobby Smirniotis are you're basically your assurance of success, right? They're your safety net in this league. You're never going to be out of the picture when one of those two is your manager, and that would be gone for one or both of those two clubs for the first time, which I think would be really interesting for the dynamics of the league as well. So we'll see when it happens, but I think it will be a big moment.
See, I don't look at them as safety nets. I look at them as builders. Like for Wheeldon, from foothills to Cavalry, that program's being built up where I think, it's no disrespect to them, it's because of the work they've done. That project's sustainable. Same thing from Sigma to Forge. The pipeline is built thanks to these two individuals. So it goes beyond, managing or coaching a team on a game-to-game, week-to-week basis. It's about building the structure and putting them in place and allowing it to thrive. So at some point, just like all of us, anyone that has kids out there, so at some point they all grow up and you just got to let them fend for themselves to a certain degree. You're there for them to care and put your arm around them, but at some time you just need to let them go. And I'm sure that will happen at some point. Just like any parent, though, you're just not in a rush to see that moment come.
Gareth already touched on a question that we want to ask next, so I would be happy to have him chime in, but I'm going to go to Ollie in case he agrees or disagrees with the following, and that is, which of the clubs outside of the top 5 has the best chance of winning a trophy? Or maybe just making the playoffs, but I guess it's the same question, because if one of them are going to make the playoffs, they would have the best chance of winning a trophy.
That didn't make the playoffs last year, I think it has to be Halifax, that you feel most confident about the direction of. I think Vancouver, just the way their season went off the rails a little bit, leaves you asking a lot of questions going into 2025. Valor, I think, keep running into the same challenges where you can picture them as a team that gets in the playoffs, but I think it's hard to see their ceiling being much more than that until there's some more substantial changes in terms of what they've got to work with at that club, frankly. So I think it has to be the Wanderers, and particularly strengthened by the fact that even if they lose a few key players who have been their building blocks under Patrice Geyser, which it looks like they will, they've already brought in Mekadesh, they've already brought in Raya, they've got some young players with talent that you feel can fill those gaps.
All right, so we promised you a look ahead. a look ahead to 2025, but how about a look ahead to 2026? Because by my basic arithmetic, that is when the World Cup is happening, and it's only about a year and a half away from properly kicking off. And what's an interesting subplot to the 2025 CPL season that ties into the question, there's nothing new happening next year for the CPL. From our understanding, it's going to be the same 8 teams. There's some managerial changes. Of course, there's always the roster moves, but the Canadian Championship format seems pretty close to dialed. The Canadian Premier League playoff format seems pretty close to dialed. So it's up to the league to challenge themselves from within, to keep that level rising, to keep building, to add excitement, because 2026 is just around the corner. And this hope that everyone in Canadian soccer has that the monetary, the tentative, and all the other windfalls associated with the event will continue to propel the league forward. I guess, Gareth, as we sort of get ready to say goodbye here, it's a question for a state of the union, perhaps, or a state of the league with the World Cup just on the near horizon.
Well, the term that I would use, or the words I would use to describe about where the Canadian Premier League stands, what are we, year and a half out from the 2026 home World Cup, is finally positioned. They've weathered the storm of having to battle and fight through COVID. A lot of the politics that have come about in Canadian soccer, like, this is now an established brand, and there's stability there, which I think is a really good thing going forward. Now, there will be changes, within the clubs themselves to figure out how to take that next step. Obviously, expansion is the one thing that's required, but coming along with it, there needs to be investment amongst those that are interested and care about the game and developing it within this country. And my hope is that with the establishment of the NSL, that more communities are willing to go out there and build soccer-specific stadiums or build practice stadiums and facilities to allow the game to expand professionally to many more markets across this country. The CPL and potential owners can't do it themselves. A lot of times the communities themselves need to get involved, or local businesses and people that are willing to finance and ensure that this dream becomes a reality and making this a long-term project. I have no reason to believe that it won't. There will be changes as well, and whether it be from the broadcast perspective or what have you. Like, there's still a lot of moving parts at play here behind the scenes that might not be front-facing. But I think that as long as they're in a position to expand by 2 teams for 2026 and 2 teams in short order after that, I think that this league is right on track and is in a position to go on and deliver even more than they have through 6 seasons already.
Oliver Platt.
Yeah, well, I think firstly, Wheels touched on it, and I think it's worth reiterating the circumstances have not been ideal at times. Like, it's not been easy with the pandemic, firstly, and then everything that's gone on in Canadian soccer to start up a new league. So I think there's a lot of positives to come through some of those things relatively unscathed. The big positive for me in terms of the league so far has always been the football. Like, it's done exactly what we said it would do in terms of player development, giving young players a pathway and opportunity, many of whom have now gone on to play at higher levels. We have players in the national team picture. I think we will have more in short order as well. And then for players coming back home towards the end of their careers, and also young coaches in this country, administrators, executives, all of those off-field staff, it's been a place to start your career, to develop and to take a step into the professional game in that way as well. So there's been massive positives there, and I think probably the league has exceeded expectations on that front. But the challenges.
Ollie, just wanted to say, like, just on that front, there's still a lot to pay attention to. MLS, potentially changing their schedule to a winter, like that's something that directly concerns Canadian teams. And the World Cup doesn't come to Canada, Ollie, if the Canadian Premier League doesn't exist. So this is like part of the reason why 2026 is happening in the first place. Yeah.
And just to finish up what I was saying, 2026, I think, is hopefully the big instigator in some of the things that have been challenging, right? Like, expansion is obviously one of them, which is mostly a stadium issue. I hope the World Cup and the NSL, again, things like that can really help on that front. And then getting the games watched by more and more people and distributed across this country. Again, I hope that the momentum of the World Cup, the attention the World Cup brings, can move the needle on that front as well. So I think we're in a good place, but a big 18 months to come.
Hopeful and optimistic note to cap up a year of Canadian Premier League coverage right here on One Soccer Today. Jordan Wilson decided he didn't want to come for today's show, so I'll thank Oliver Platt and Gareth Wheeler instead for their insightful and honest coverage as always. This has been One Soccer Today, and we're glad you spent some time with us.